You can have another wedding someday. Your brother is about to lose everything. That was the sentence my mother chose to say on the morning I was supposed to become a bride. She didn't shout it. She didn't sound cruel. She said it the way someone might explain why dinner plans had to change. I was standing in the dressing room of a small lakeside venue, wearing the white dress I had spent 2 years saving for. My hair was half pinned up. My bouquet rested on the table beside me. Outside, guests were beginning to arrive, and my phone would not stop vibrating. First, it was my mother, Margaret Harper. Then my father, Thomas Harper. Then my aunt. Then 2 cousins. Each call carried the same message. My younger brother, Ryan, had a situation. Something serious. Something urgent. Something the whole family needed to handle immediately, which meant they couldn't come to my wedding. At first I thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. Families don't just skip their daughter's wedding. Not all at once, not without explanation. But within 20 minutes, the truth settled in like cold water. My parents weren't coming. Ryan obviously wasn't coming. And one by one, the rest of the Harper family decided they would go with them. Apparently, whatever disaster Ryan had created was more important than the day I had spent years planning, more important than the vows, more important than the promise my father made to walk me down the aisle. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock that afternoon. By 2:30, 40 white chairs had been arranged in neat rows beside the lake. 32 of them were empty. I stood behind the wooden doors, my bouquet shaking in my hands. Staring at the aisle, my father was supposed to walk with me. And in that quiet moment, I realized something that hurt more than their absence. My wedding hadn't just revealed who loved me, it revealed who had never planned to choose me at all. And that was the day I finally stopped waiting to be chosen. Before I continue telling Elena Harper's story, I want to ask you something. If you were Elena, standing in your wedding dress, seeing the empty seats where your family should have been, and knowing that your parents chose your younger brother over your wedding day, what would you do? Would you cancel the wedding right then and there? Or would you still walk down the aisle, even knowing that the most important people in your life wouldn't be there? Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to know what you would choose in that moment. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And believe me, what happens next in Elena Harper's story is even more surprising. Because just when she thought she had to walk down the aisle alone, a completely unexpected person appeared behind her. If you want to know who took Elena's hand and changed her entire wedding day, keep listening to the next part of the story. My name is Elena Harper, and if you had looked at my family from the outside, you probably would have thought we were perfectly normal. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Hartford, the kind of street where every house had trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, and the same American flags hanging on the porch every summer. My father, Thomas Harper, worked as an operations manager for a logistics company. He was the kind of man who believed in routines, early mornings, and the idea that stability meant success. My mother, Margaret Harper, stayed home for most of my childhood. She volunteered at church events, organized neighborhood bake sales, and cared deeply about one thing above everything else: how our family looked to other people. From the outside, we were the Harpers, polite, respectable, dependable. But inside that house, there was a rule no one ever said out loud. Everything revolved around Ryan. Ryan Harper was my younger brother, 2 years younger, but somehow always the center of gravity in our home. If Ryan wanted something, the entire house shifted to make room for it. If Ryan failed a class, my parents called the school. If Ryan crashed his car, my parents said the road must have been dangerous. If Ryan lost money trying to start some half-baked business idea, they called it a learning experience. And somehow, every single time, the solution involved the rest of us adjusting our lives around him. Meanwhile, I learned very early what my role was supposed to be. I was the responsible one, the calm one, the one who understood. Whenever Ryan made a mistake, my mother would sigh and say the same sentence: "Elena, you're the older one. You need to be patient with him." At first, when we were kids, I believed that. I believed patience meant love. I believed being understanding meant I was a good daughter. But as the years passed, something slowly became clear. Patience in our house only flowed in one direction, toward Ryan, never toward me. For example, when I was 17, I won a small statewide art scholarship. It wasn't huge, just a local award for young illustrators, but to me it meant everything. I remember bringing the certificate home that afternoon, my hands shaking with excitement. I thought maybe, just this once, everyone would be proud. But when I walked into the kitchen, my parents were already dealing with another Ryan emergency. He had just been suspended from school for fighting. My father was furious. My mother was crying. And my scholarship certificate sat quietly on the kitchen counter while the entire evening turned into a discussion about how Ryan's future might be ruined. No one ever asked about the award. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. Eventually, I stopped expecting those moments. Instead, I built my life quietly. Piece by piece. I went to college. I worked 2 part-time jobs. I paid my own rent. And over time, I learned something important. When you stop waiting for recognition, you also stop giving people the power to withhold it. Then, 3 years ago, I met Daniel Reed. Daniel was nothing like the people my family admired. He didn't wear expensive suits. He didn't talk about investment opportunities or startup ideas. He was a structural engineer who loved quiet evenings, old vinyl records, and cooking pasta from scratch. But Daniel had something rare. He listened, really listened. The first time I told him about my childhood, about Ryan, about the constant feeling of being second, Daniel didn't try to explain it away. He didn't say your parents probably meant well. Instead, he just squeezed my hand and said something simple. That must have been really lonely. And somehow, hearing someone acknowledge that truth felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed for years. Over time, we built a life together, not a glamorous one, not the kind of life my parents would brag about at dinner parties, but it was stable, it was honest, and most importantly, it was ours. 2 years later, Daniel proposed during a quiet walk by the lake, no crowd, no cameras. Just the 2 of us and a small silver ring he had saved months to buy. When I called my parents that night, my mother sounded surprised, not unhappy, just surprised. Well, that's sudden, Margaret said. My father asked practical questions. What kind of job does Daniel have again? Ryan, on the other hand, barely reacted at all. Cool, he said. Then he changed the subject. Still, I told myself something important. This would be different. This would be the moment my family finally showed up, because weddings are different. Weddings are the moments when families come together, when parents remember their promises, when fathers walk their daughters down the aisle, and for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to believe something simple, that on my wedding day, the Harper family would finally choose me. I didn't know then how wrong I was, and I definitely didn't know that the first crack in that belief had already begun, with a phone call from my mother 2 weeks before the wedding, about another one of Ryan's situations. For a long time, I told myself that weddings were different. Families might argue about small things. They might forget birthdays or overlook achievements. But a wedding, see, a daughter's wedding, that was supposed to be sacred territory. At least, that's what I believed. And for a while, it even seemed like my belief might be right. Daniel and I decided to keep the wedding simple. Neither of us wanted something extravagant. No ballroom, no 5-tier cake, no $100,000 reception designed more for photographs than memories. Instead, we found a small venue beside a lake just outside the city. It had a wooden dock, a stretch of green lawn, and a line of old willow trees that bent toward the water like they were whispering secrets. The ceremony would be outside, 40 chairs, a small arch made of pale wood and white flowers, and a quiet dinner afterward with the people we loved most. To me, it felt perfect. Better than perfect. Actually, because for the first time, I felt like something in my life was truly mine. Daniel helped design the layout. Sophie, my best friend, volunteered to organize the music. I spent nights at the kitchen table sketching invitation designs because illustration was still my favorite way to make things personal. And slowly, piece by piece, the wedding began to take shape. But while I was busy planning the happiest day of my life, something else was happening quietly in the background. At first, I didn't notice it. It started with small things. For example, my mother stopped asking questions about the wedding details. At the beginning, Margaret had seemed interested. She asked about the flowers, the guest list, the dress. But a month before the wedding, her attention drifted elsewhere. Phone calls grew shorter. Conversations changed direction. And more often than not, Ryan's name appeared somewhere in the middle of them. Ryan's working on a new business idea. Ryan met some investors. Ryan's under a lot of pressure right now. At first, I didn't think much about it. Ryan always had some kind of project going. Restaurants, online stores, cryptocurrency, real estate flips. He jumped from one opportunity to another like stepping stones across a river. Most of them didn't last very long, but my parents always treated each one like it was the beginning of a financial empire. Still, I assumed that whatever Ryan was dealing with had nothing to do with my wedding, until about 3 weeks before the ceremony. That was the first time the cracks became impossible to ignore. I was sitting in our apartment with Daniel, reviewing the final guest list. We were deciding where everyone would sit at dinner when my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded different the moment I answered. Not excited. Not cheerful. Tense. "Elena," she said, "I need to ask you something." The way she said it made my stomach tighten. "What's going on?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she said the sentence that would start unraveling everything. "Ryan's going through a difficult situation right now." I leaned back in my chair. "What kind of situation?" "Well," Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "He had a business deal that didn't work out the way he expected." Daniel glanced up from the table when he heard the shift in my tone. "How serious is it?" I asked. Another pause. "Serious enough that we're trying to help him figure things out." Now something inside me started to feel uneasy, because in our family, helping Ryan figure things out almost always meant one thing: money. I tried to keep my voice calm. "What does that have to do with the wedding?" "Nothing," Margaret said quickly. Too quickly. "I just wanted you to know he's under a lot of stress." At the time, I accepted that explanation. Maybe because I wanted to. Maybe because the idea that my wedding could somehow become entangled in Ryan's problems felt too absurd to consider. After all, weddings don't get overshadowed by someone else's bad decisions, not when the family knows how much that day matters. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. And yet, over the following days, the pattern became harder to ignore. My father started canceling wedding-related conversations. My mother seemed distracted whenever the ceremony came up. Ryan stopped answering my messages entirely. It was subtle, small shifts, but enough to create a quiet, growing tension in the air. Meanwhile, Daniel noticed it too. One evening, as we were sealing invitation envelopes at the dining table, he looked at me carefully and asked, "Do you think something else is going on with your family?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to laugh and brush the idea away. But the truth was, a small voice in the back of my mind had already begun whispering the same question. Still, I shook my head. "It's probably nothing," I said. And for a moment, I believed that. But what I didn't know then, what none of us knew yet, was that Ryan's situation was far worse than anyone had admitted. And even worse than that, my parents had already started making decisions about how to deal with it. Decisions that would eventually lead to the moment when my mother said the sentence I will never forget: "You can have another wedding someday." Because by then, in their minds, the problem wasn't Ryan. The problem was simply that my wedding was happening at the wrong time. At first, the signs were so small that I almost ignored them. Looking back now, I realize they were everywhere. But when something threatens a moment you've spent years waiting for, the human mind does a strange thing. It protects the dream, and that's exactly what I did. For the next several days after my mother's phone call, I convinced myself that Ryan's problems had nothing to do with my wedding. Life had always been chaotic around Ryan, but this time would be different. This time, the chaos would stay contained. At least, that was what I told myself. Meanwhile, Daniel and I continued preparing for the ceremony. The invitations had already been sent out. The florist confirmed the order. The venue coordinator emailed the final seating layout. Everything was moving forward exactly the way it should. Or at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. However, underneath all of that planning, something else was slowly shifting. For example, when I called my father, Thomas Harper, to confirm whether he wanted to rehearse the walk down the aisle, his response was oddly distracted. "Let's talk about it later," he said quickly. Later never came. Then, a few days afterward, I noticed something even stranger. My mother stopped mentioning the wedding entirely. Every conversation drifted somewhere else, usually back to Ryan. At first, it was small updates. "Ryan has been meeting with some people. Ryan's trying to fix the situation. Ryan is under a lot of pressure right now." The more she repeated those sentences, the more uneasy I started to feel. Finally, one evening, about 2 weeks before the wedding, that uneasy feeling turned into something much more concrete. Daniel and I were sitting in the living room reviewing our budget spreadsheet. Weddings, even small ones, have a way of stretching finances in unexpected directions. We had been careful about everything. The venue deposit had already been paid. The caterer was scheduled. And the rest of the expenses were sitting in the joint family account my parents had helped manage. That account contained the money my parents had promised to contribute to the wedding. It wasn't a huge amount, but it covered a few important pieces: the photographer, part of the catering, and the final venue payment. I opened the banking app on my phone to double-check one of the invoices, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a display error. The balance looked wrong, much lower than it should have been. I refreshed the screen. Then I refreshed it again. The number didn't change. A withdrawal had been made 3 days earlier, a large one, large enough that it had removed almost half the remaining wedding budget. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Daniel noticed the silence. "What's wrong?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I scrolled down to the transaction details. The transfer had been authorized from my mother's account, and the destination was a name I didn't recognize, but the memo line told me everything I needed to know. Loan assistance, Ryan. I felt something cold settle into my chest. Daniel leaned closer. "Elena." I handed him the phone. He studied the screen for several seconds before looking back at me. "Did you know about this?" I shook my head slowly. No. At that moment, my mind was trying to process two completely different realities at once. Reality number one, someone had just taken a large portion of the money meant for our wedding. Reality number two, that someone was my mother, and the money had gone to Ryan. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. I just sat there, staring at the screen like it might suddenly rearrange itself into a different explanation. But it didn't. Finally, Daniel spoke carefully. "Maybe she meant to tell you." That sentence was kind, but we both knew it probably wasn't true. Still, I picked up my phone and called my mother. The call rang 4 times before she answered. "Elena," Margaret said, her voice already cautious. "Is everything okay?" I took a breath. "Mom, I just checked the account." There was a pause, a long one. Then she sighed. "I was going to talk to you about that." My heart dropped. "You took the wedding money." "It's not like that," she said quickly. "Then how is it?" Another pause, and then the explanation came. Ryan had gotten himself into a serious financial situation. A business partner had backed out of a deal. There were debts. People were asking questions. And according to Margaret, the situation needed to be handled immediately. He just needed a little help getting back on his feet, she said. "A little help," I repeated quietly. "Mom, that's half the wedding budget." "I know," she said, her voice tightening. "But Ryan is your brother." That sentence landed like a stone. For years, those 4 words had been used to explain everything. Why Ryan needed more attention. Why Ryan needed more support. Why Ryan needed more understanding. But hearing it now, 2 weeks before my wedding, felt different. Because suddenly, the implication behind it became impossible to ignore. If Ryan needed something badly enough, then my wedding was negotiable. I tried to keep my voice steady. "So what happens to the rest of the wedding payments?" "We'll figure it out," Margaret said. "We always do." But this time, I didn't feel reassured. Instead, a quiet realization began forming in my mind. My parents hadn't just helped Ryan. They had made a decision about priorities. And whether they meant to or not, that decision said something very clear. When Ryan needed something, my wedding was optional. At the time, I still didn't understand just how far that decision would go, but I would find out soon enough. Because 2 weeks later, on the morning of my wedding, my phone would ring again, and my mother would say the sentence that changed everything: "You can have another wedding someday." For a long time after that phone call, I just sat there staring at the wall. Daniel had gone quiet beside me, giving me space. The way he always did when he sensed something inside me was shifting. But the truth was, something had already shifted, something fundamental. Because for the first time in my life, the pattern I had spent years pretending not to see was suddenly impossible to ignore. Ryan needed help, and without even asking me, my parents had taken the money meant for my wedding to give it to him. Still, a part of me wasn't ready to accept what that meant. So the next morning, I called my mother again, not to fight, not to accuse, just to understand. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Elena." "Sweetheart." "Mom," I said gently, interrupting her, "I need to ask you something honestly." There was a pause. "Okay." "Did you ever plan to tell me you were taking the wedding money?" Silence. Not the kind of silence where someone is thinking, the kind where someone already knows the answer will hurt. Finally, she spoke. "We were going to figure it out before the wedding." The words were careful, but they didn't actually answer my question. I pressed a little further. "You didn't ask me." "Well," she said, her voice tightening slightly. Ryan needed the money immediately. And there it was again. Ryan needed. In our family, those two words had always carried more weight than anything else. Still, I tried one last time. "Mom, what if we can't cover the rest of the costs now?" "We will," she said quickly. "Your father and I will make sure everything works out." But something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten again, because there was another truth hiding underneath her reassurance. My parents were not wealthy. Helping Ryan like this meant they were stretching themselves thin, and when people stretch themselves too thin, something always has to give. I just hadn't realized yet what that something might be. Meanwhile, the wedding date kept getting closer. 2 weeks, then 10 days, then 7. On the surface, everything still looked normal. The venue confirmed the ceremony schedule. The florist called to review the flower arrangements. Sophie texted me photos of the dress she planned to wear as maid of honor. And Daniel, as always, kept reminding me of the one thing that mattered most. "We're getting married," he said one night while we were washing dishes together. "That's the important part." He was right, of course. The wedding wasn't about flowers or seating charts. It wasn't about catering menus or decorations. It was about two people promising to build a life together. And yet, despite knowing that, there was still one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. My father's promise. For as long as I could remember, I had imagined that moment. The walk down the aisle. The music. My father's arm linked with mine, and the quiet understanding between us that he was giving me away, not because he was losing a daughter, but because he trusted the man waiting at the end of the aisle. That moment mattered to me more than anything else. So 3 days after the money conversation, I called him. Thomas Harper answered in his usual steady voice. "Elena." "Hey." "Dad, how are the wedding plans coming along?" The question sounded normal, but it also felt strangely distant, like we were discussing someone else's wedding. "They're okay," I said carefully. Then I took a breath. "Dad, you're still walking me down the aisle, right?" There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough that I noticed it. "Of course," he said. "You're my daughter." Relief washed over me so quickly that it almost made me laugh. For the first time in days, the tension inside my chest loosened. "Okay," I said softly. "I just wanted to make sure." After we hung up, I turned to Daniel and smiled. "He'll be there." Daniel smiled back, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes. Not worried, just observant. And for a brief second, I wondered if he was seeing something I wasn't. Still, I pushed the thought away, because sometimes the heart clings to hope even when logic whispers otherwise. The week before the wedding passed in a blur. Last-minute phone calls, dress fittings, seating arrangements. And through it all, Ryan remained strangely absent. He didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't even acknowledge the wedding anymore. At first, I assumed he was embarrassed about the money situation. Then I assumed he was simply too busy dealing with whatever crisis he had created. Either way, I let it go. After all, Ryan had never been particularly interested in my milestones, but my parents would be there. That was what mattered. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. Then, the night before the wedding arrived, Daniel and I checked into a small room at the lakeside venue. Tradition said we shouldn't see each other before the ceremony, so we said goodnight early. Sophie stayed with me while we reviewed the final details. Everything was ready. The chairs were arranged. The arch had been decorated. The flowers would arrive at sunrise. For a few hours that evening, I allowed myself to relax. Tomorrow would be beautiful. Tomorrow would be the day everything came together. But somewhere across the city, at that exact same moment, Ryan Harper was creating a problem far bigger than anyone had admitted. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, that problem would pull my entire family away from the place they had promised to be, leaving me standing in a white dress, holding a bouquet, and waiting for people who were never going to arrive. The morning of my wedding began with sunlight, soft, pale light drifting through the thin curtains of the lakeside room. For a moment, I forgot everything. The money, Ryan's problems, the uneasy conversations, all of it. Instead, there was only the quiet excitement that comes from knowing that your life is about to change. Sophie was already awake when I sat up. She was standing by the window, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Well," she said with a smile, "today's the day." I laughed nervously as I took the cup. Today's the day. Outside, the lake was perfectly still. The willow trees bent gently in the breeze, their long branches brushing the water like slow brush strokes. Everything looked calm, peaceful, exactly the way I had imagined it. Meanwhile, the venue staff had already started preparing the ceremony space. From the window, I could see them setting up the final details. White chairs arranged in rows, the wooden arch standing at the edge of the grass, small baskets of flowers waiting to be placed along the aisle. It was real now. After months of planning, everything had finally come together, and despite everything that had happened with my family, I allowed myself to believe one simple thing. They would still show up, because no matter what Ryan was dealing with, this was my wedding day. Sophie helped me into the dress about an hour later. The fabric felt lighter than I expected, almost weightless. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because the moment felt so big, so final. Like standing at the edge of one life and preparing to step into another. "You look incredible," Sophie said quietly. I smiled, trying not to cry. "Daniel is going to lose his mind when he sees you." For a few minutes, everything felt perfect. Then my phone rang. At first, I almost ignored it. But when I glanced at the screen, my stomach tightened instantly. "Mom," I answered the call. "Hi." "Mom." For a moment, there was only breathing on the other end of the line. Then Margaret spoke. "Elena." Something about her voice was wrong. It wasn't the calm, controlled tone she usually used. This sounded rushed, panicked. "What's going on?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she said the sentence that split the day in half. "Ryan is in serious trouble." My chest tightened. "What kind of trouble?" He had a problem with some investors." "What does that mean?" Another pause. Then the truth slipped out. "There are people looking for him." The words didn't make sense at first. Looking for him how? "They think he owes them money." I felt a cold wave spread through my body. "Mom, why are you telling me this right now?" Silence. Then Margaret said the thing I will never forget. "We have to go help him." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. "What?" "Your father and I need to meet with him. He's scared. He doesn't know what to do." My heart started beating faster. "Mom, the wedding starts in 2 hours." "I know. You're supposed to be here." "I know." Every answer came quickly. Too quickly. Like she had already rehearsed this conversation in her head. "Mom," I said slowly, trying to stay calm. "Dad is walking me down the aisle." Another pause. A longer one this time. Then she said it. The sentence that changed everything. "You can have another wedding someday." The world went silent. Not quiet, silent, like every sound in the room had been pulled away. I couldn't breathe for a second. "Mom," I whispered. "What did you just say?" "Elena, listen to me." Ryan could be in real danger. And I'm not. The words came out sharper than I intended. This is my wedding. I know that. Then why aren't you coming? Her voice softened, like she was trying to calm a child. Because right now, your brother needs us more. There it was. The sentence I had been hearing my entire life. Ryan needs us more. Except this time, it wasn't about a broken car or a failed business idea. This time, it was about my wedding day. I closed my eyes. For years, I had convinced myself the pattern would eventually change, that one day, my parents would choose me. But now, standing in a white dress with a bouquet waiting beside me, I finally understood something. They had already made their choice, and they had made it a long time ago. I have to go, my mother said quietly. We'll talk later. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. Sophie was staring at me from across the room. What happened? For a few seconds, I couldn't answer. Finally, I managed to speak. They're not coming. The words sounded unreal, like they belonged to someone else's story. Sophie's eyes widened. What do you mean they're not coming? My parents are helping Ryan. And Dad isn't walking me down the aisle. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had moved closer. Outside, guests were beginning to arrive, cars pulling into the gravel parking lot, people stepping out in suits and dresses, everyone expecting to see a bride walk down the aisle with her father. Instead, I stood there holding my phone, trying to understand how the most important day of my life had suddenly turned into another chapter of the same old story. Ryan needed something, and everything else had to move aside. Even a wedding, even a daughter. But what I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that someone else had already seen what was happening, and just minutes before the ceremony began, that person would step forward and ask a question that would change the entire day. Do you mind if I walk you down the aisle? For a few seconds after Sophie asked what happened, I couldn't answer. The room felt strangely quiet. Even though outside I could hear the distant sounds of guests arriving, car doors closing, footsteps on gravel, faint laughter drifting across the lawn. Everything was moving forward, except me. I was still standing there, holding my phone, staring at the blank screen where my mother's name had just disappeared. They're not coming, I finally said. The words sounded hollow. Sophie blinked, as if she needed a moment to process them. What do you mean they're not coming? My parents, I said slowly. They went to help Ryan. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then her face changed, not into shock, but into something closer to anger. Today, she asked. I nodded. Today, she let out a breath and shook her head slightly, like she was trying to keep herself from saying something much harsher. That's unbelievable. I didn't disagree, but strangely, I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Instead, what I felt was something quieter, a deep, familiar kind of disappointment, the kind that doesn't explode, the kind that settles slowly in your chest, like a weight you've carried for years and only just realized was there. Outside, the ceremony coordinator knocked gently on the door. Elena, she called. We're ready whenever you are. Ready. The word felt almost ironic, because the one moment I had imagined my entire life, walking down the aisle with my father beside me, had just vanished. I sat down slowly on the edge of the chair. For the first time that morning, doubt crept into my mind. Could I really do this? Could I walk out there? Alone, knowing everyone expected something else. Sophie crouched down in front of me. Hey, she said softly. You don't have to rush. But I shook my head. It's not that. Then what is it? I looked down at my hands. For a moment, I thought about the little girl I used to be. The one who believed that weddings were magical days when families proved how much they loved each other. That girl had imagined a father's arm linked with hers, proud parents in the front row, smiles, photographs, a perfect moment. But life rarely follows the version we imagine, and maybe, just maybe, that didn't mean the moment was ruined. Before I could say anything else, the door opened quietly behind us. Both Sophie and I turned. Standing there was Mr. Harold Whitman, Daniel's grandfather. He was in his early 70s, tall and straight-backed despite the years, wearing a dark gray suit that looked carefully pressed. He had always been one of the calmest people I'd ever met. The kind of man who spoke slowly, but when he did, everyone listened. He stepped into the room gently. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. Sophie stood up. "Mr. Whitman," but he raised a hand slightly. "I just wanted to check if everything was all right." For a moment, neither of us answered. Then he looked at my face carefully, and somehow, without anyone explaining anything, he seemed to understand. "Your parents?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "They couldn't come." He didn't react with surprise. Instead, he simply gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "I see." There was a short silence. Then he stepped a little closer. "Elena," he said gently. "Yes. May I ask you something?" I wiped quickly at my eyes and tried to smile. "Of course." He hesitated for just a second. Then he said the sentence that changed everything about that moment. "Would you mind if I walked you down the aisle?" For a heartbeat, the room went completely still. I hadn't expected that. Not even close. My first instinct was to protest. "Oh, Mr. Whitman, I couldn't possibly," but he shook his head softly. "You could." His voice remained calm, steady. "I know I'm not your father." He paused. "But today isn't about who is supposed to stand beside you. It's about making sure you don't have to walk alone." The words hit me harder than I expected, because suddenly, something inside me shifted. All morning, I had been thinking about the people who weren't there, the people who had chosen something else. But standing in front of me now was someone who had simply stepped forward, not because he had to, not because it was expected, but because he cared. Sophie's voice broke the silence. "I think that's a beautiful idea." I looked back at Mr. Whitman. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't insisting. He was simply waiting. And for the first time since that phone call from my mother, something warm replaced the tight knot in my chest. Hope. I stood slowly. "Are you sure?" I asked. He smiled gently, completely. For a moment, emotion caught in my throat. Then I nodded. "I would be honored." Mr. Whitman offered his arm. Outside, the music had already begun to play softly. Guests were seated. Daniel was waiting at the end of the aisle, probably wondering why the ceremony hadn't started yet. I took a deep breath. Then I slipped my arm through his, and together, we stepped toward the door. Because sometimes the people who stand beside you on the most important day of your life are not the ones you expected. They are simply the ones who chose to show up. The moment the doors opened, the music grew louder. Soft piano notes floated across the lawn, blending with the gentle sound of wind moving through the willow trees beside the lake. For a split second, I hesitated. Because standing on the edge of the ceremony space, I could finally see everyone. Rows of guests turned toward the aisle. Friends, Daniel's relatives, a few distant cousins, and empty seats in the front row where my parents were supposed to be. The sight hit me like a quiet wave, but before doubt could settle in again, I felt Mr. Whitman's arm steady beside mine. "Ready?" he asked gently. I took a slow breath, then I nodded. "Yes." And together, we stepped forward. The gravel path beneath my shoes made a soft crunching sound with every step. At first, the guests seemed slightly confused. A few people glanced toward the empty seats in the front row. Others looked at Mr. Whitman with curiosity. But something interesting happened as we walked farther down the aisle. The confusion slowly faded, because the way Mr. Whitman walked beside me, calm, proud, completely certain, made the moment feel exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Not awkward, not incomplete, just different. And somehow, that difference made the moment even more meaningful. Halfway down the aisle, I looked up and saw Daniel. He was standing beneath the wooden arch, sunlight falling across his shoulders. For a moment, his expression showed pure confusion. Then he saw who was walking beside me, and suddenly, everything in his face softened. Understanding, respect, gratitude. Daniel nodded slightly toward his grandfather. A silent thank you. That small exchange meant more to me than I can explain, because in that instant, I realized something important. Families aren't always defined by blood. Sometimes they're defined by who chooses to stand with you when the moment matters. Step by step, we reached the front of the aisle. Mr. Whitman stopped just beside Daniel. For a brief moment, the three of us stood there together. Then he turned to me and spoke quietly. Your father may not be here today, he said. But that doesn't mean you aren't walking into a beautiful life. Emotion rose quickly in my chest. Before I could stop myself, I hugged him. Not a formal hug, a real one. The kind that carries gratitude, relief, and something close to healing. Thank you, I whispered. He smiled and gently placed my hand in Daniel's. Then he stepped aside and took his seat in the front row. The officiant cleared his throat softly. And just like that, the ceremony began. At first, I worried the moment might feel strange, that the absence of my parents would hang over everything like a shadow. But surprisingly, it didn't. Instead, something else filled the space. Warmth, support, presence. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, the guests laughed softly at the traditional question. When Daniel began his vows, his voice trembled slightly. Elena, he said, from the moment we met, you showed me what strength looks like. I felt tears forming again. Not sad tears, different ones. I promise that no matter what life throws at us, he continued, you will never have to face it alone. Those words landed deeper than he probably realized. Because just an hour earlier, I had believed I would have to walk through one of the most important days of my life completely alone. But I wasn't. Not really. Around us were friends who had traveled hours to be there. Sophie, smiling proudly in the front row. Daniel's family, watching with warmth. And Mr. Whitman, sitting quietly, his expression calm and proud. Then it was my turn to speak. For a second, my voice caught. But Daniel squeezed my hand gently, and suddenly the words came. Daniel, I said. For most of my life, I believed love meant patience. Being the understanding one, waiting for people to show up. I paused, glancing briefly toward the empty seats. But you taught me something different. Love isn't just about waiting. It's about choosing each other every single day. Daniel smiled. And for the first time all morning, I felt completely at peace. The rest of the ceremony passed almost like a dream. The vows, the rings, the quiet applause when the officiant announced us husband and wife. Then Daniel kissed me, and the guests erupted into cheers. As we walked back down the aisle together, I noticed something unexpected. People weren't whispering about the missing parents. They weren't focused on what had gone wrong. Instead, they were smiling, laughing, celebrating. Because what mattered wasn't who had chosen to stay away. What mattered was what had happened anyway. A wedding, a promise, a beginning. Later, during the reception, Mr. Whitman found me near the lake. He handed me a glass of champagne. You handled today with remarkable grace, he said. I smiled softly. I didn't feel graceful. Most strong people don't realize when they're being strong. For a moment, we watched the sunlight reflecting across the water. Then he added quietly, sometimes life removes the people who were never meant to stand beside you. And in doing so, it makes space for the people who were. I thought about my parents, about Ryan, about the years of disappointment. And strangely, I didn't feel anger anymore, just clarity. Because that day had shown me something important. The people who truly belong in your life will never force you to beg for their presence. They will simply show up. And sometimes, they will even step forward when you least expect it. The wedding ended the way most weddings do, with music, laughter, and people slowly saying goodbye as the evening light faded across the lake. By the time the last guests left, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue, and the willow trees along the water moved softly in the night breeze. Daniel and I stood together on the dock, watching the reflections of small lights ripple across the lake. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It had been a long day, a beautiful one, but also an emotional one. Finally, Daniel squeezed my hand gently. How are you feeling? He asked. I thought about the question carefully, because the answer wasn't simple. I'm okay, I said. Not sad, not angry, just aware. Aware that something important had changed inside me that day. For most of my life, I had spent so much energy hoping my parents would treat me differently, hoping they would eventually choose me the way they chose Ryan. But standing in that wedding dress earlier that afternoon, when my mother told me I could have another wedding someday, something inside me had finally shifted. Not broken, shifted, like a door quietly closing. And another one opening. Daniel nodded slowly. as if he understood exactly what I meant without needing me to explain it. "You handled today with a lot of grace," he said. I smiled faintly. I had good help. We both looked toward the reception area where Mr. Marcel Whitman was still talking with a few relatives. For a moment, warmth spread through my chest again, because sometimes the most important family members are the ones who arrive unexpectedly. Eventually, we returned to our room. The quiet after the celebration felt almost surreal. My phone had been buzzing throughout the evening, but I had ignored it. Now, sitting on the edge of the bed, I finally picked it up. Several messages had appeared. Most were from friends who had attended the wedding. Photos, congratulations, little jokes about how emotional the ceremony had been. But near the bottom of the screen, there was one message that made my stomach tighten. "Mom." The message had been sent 2 hours earlier. "Elena, call me when you can." I stared at the words for a moment. Part of me wanted to ignore it. After everything that had happened that day, I felt like I had already heard enough. But another part of me knew avoiding the conversation wouldn't actually change anything. So I stepped outside onto the small balcony and called her back. Margaret answered quickly. "Elena." Her voice sounded relieved. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked the obvious question. How was the wedding? The question felt strange, like asking someone how their graduation ceremony went after deciding not to attend. It was beautiful. I said simply. There was a pause. "I'm glad," she replied. Another silence followed. Then she added quietly, "We're sorry we couldn't make it." The words hung in the air. For years, that kind of apology would have opened the door to a long emotional conversation. I would have explained how much it hurt, how disappointed I felt, how important the day had been. But this time, I didn't feel the need, because the truth had already revealed itself. And once you see the truth clearly, you stop needing explanations. "I understand," I said. She sounded slightly surprised. "You do." Yes. On the other end of the line, I could hear my father speaking quietly in the background. Ryan's name drifted faintly through the conversation. Even now, he was still the center of the situation. Margaret lowered her voice. Ryan's situation became very complicated. I figured we didn't know what else to do. For a moment, I looked out across the lake again. The water was completely still now. Then I said something I had never said to my parents before. "I hope you were able to help him." Another pause. Then she answered softly, "We're trying." And that was it. No argument. No emotional confrontation. Just acceptance. Not acceptance that what they did was right, but acceptance that they had made their choice. And now I was making mine. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time. Daniel stepped onto the balcony a few minutes later. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." Then I looked at him and smiled. Not a forced smile. A real one. Because in that moment, something became very clear. The story of my life wasn't defined by the people who failed to show up. It was defined by the people who did. Daniel wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked. I looked out at the quiet lake, thinking about everything that had happened. The disappointment, the unexpected kindness, the moment Mr. Whitman offered his arm, and the promise Daniel and I had made beneath the willow trees. "Yes," I said, because for the first time in a long time, I understood something important. Family isn't always the people who raised you. Sometimes, family is simply the people who choose to stand beside you when the moment truly matters. Time has a quiet way of revealing the truth. Not all at once, not in dramatic moments, but slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize the story looks very different from the way it once did. 3 months after the wedding, Daniel and I had settled into a rhythm that felt peaceful. Our apartment was small, but it was warm and full of light in the mornings. On weekends, we walked by the lake near our neighborhood, sometimes talking about work, sometimes talking about nothing at all. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady. And after everything that had happened during the wedding, that steadiness felt like a gift. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents had changed in ways that were both subtle and significant. We still spoke occasionally, short phone calls, polite conversations. But something fundamental had shifted. For years, I had tried to be the bridge in our family, the one who smoothed over problems, who understood everyone's perspective, who quietly accepted disappointment in order to keep the peace. After the wedding, I stopped doing that, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because once you recognize a pattern, you can't pretend it isn't there anymore. One afternoon in early autumn, my mother called again. The air outside our apartment window had begun turning crisp, the trees slowly changing color. "Elena," Margaret said, her voice hesitant. "Yes, we wanted to talk about visiting." The word we caught my attention. "You and Dad." "Yes." There was another pause before she continued. "Ryan, too," for a moment. I said nothing, not because I was surprised, but because I knew exactly what this visit probably meant. Ryan had likely run into another problem. And once again, the family circle was closing around him. Still, I answered calmly, "You're welcome to visit." Margaret sounded relieved. "Thank you." "Sweetheart," when the visit finally happened 2 weeks later, it felt strangely formal. My parents arrived with a small housewarming gift. Ryan came behind them, looking a little tired, but otherwise the same as always. Confident, restless, as if life were a game that simply required another clever move. Dinner was polite, careful. Everyone seemed aware of the unspoken history sitting quietly at the table with us. Finally, halfway through the meal, Ryan leaned back in his chair. "So," he said casually, "I guess I owe you an apology." I looked up. "For what?" "You know, the wedding thing?" He said it lightly, like mentioning a forgotten birthday. I didn't mean for everything to get so dramatic. The room went silent. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father stared at his plate, but surprisingly, I didn't feel the sharp anger I might have expected. Instead, I simply asked one question. "Did you ask them to miss the wedding?" Ryan frowned slightly. "What? Did you ask Mom and Dad not to come?" For a moment, he looked genuinely confused. "No," he said. "They decided that." I nodded slowly. Because in that moment, something important became clear. Ryan hadn't forced them to choose him. They had chosen him on their own. And that realization removed the last piece of resentment I had been holding on to. After dinner, while Daniel and my father talked in the living room, my mother pulled me aside. "Elena," she said quietly, "I know the wedding situation hurt you." I looked at her calmly. "Yes, it did." She hesitated. "We did the best we could." That sentence used to frustrate me, but now it simply sounded honest, not correct. Just honest. "I believe you," I said. Her eyes searched my face. "Do you forgive us?" For a long moment, I thought about the question. Forgiveness isn't always about forgetting, and it isn't always about pretending nothing happened. Sometimes it's simply about deciding not to carry the weight anymore. "Yes," I said finally, "I forgive you." Relief flickered across her face. But then I added something else. "That doesn't mean things go back to the way they were." She nodded slowly. "I understand." And surprisingly, I think she did. Later that night, after everyone left, Daniel and I stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow softly along the sidewalk. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. And this time, I meant it completely. Because the truth was, the most important moment of my wedding day had never been about the people who didn't show up. It had been about the person who did. The moment when Mr. Whitman offered his arm and said I didn't have to walk alone. That moment changed everything. Not because it erased the disappointment, but because it reminded me of something far more important. Life will always show you who people truly are. Some will disappoint you. Some will surprise you. And some will quietly step forward when you need them most. The real lesson isn't learning how to avoid disappointment. The real lesson is learning how to recognize the people who choose to stand beside you anyway. Because those people, those are the ones who become your real family. And sometimes, the most beautiful beginning in life starts not with the family you expected, but with the one you build yourself. 6 months passed after the wedding. Time, as it often does, soften the sharp edges of what had happened, not by erasing the memory, but by placing it into perspective. Daniel and I slowly built the quiet life we had promised each other that afternoon beneath the willow trees. Our apartment began to feel more like a home with every passing week. Books appeared on the shelves. Plants grew on the windowsill. Photographs from the wedding were framed and placed carefully around the living room. One of them always caught my attention. It wasn't the photo of Daniel and me exchanging vows. It wasn't even the photo of our first kiss as husband and wife. Instead, the one that meant the most showed something much simpler. It was the moment Mr. Whitman offered his arm as we began walking down the aisle together. Every time I saw that photograph, it reminded me of something important. Sometimes the most meaningful moments in life arrive quietly, disguised as small acts of kindness. Meanwhile, life around us continued moving forward. Daniel's engineering projects kept him busy during the week, and I returned to illustration work that I had quietly neglected while planning the wedding. Gradually, the emotional weight of that day faded into something calmer, but the story of my family didn't end there, because a few months later, something unexpected happened. One evening in early winter, my phone rang again. The name on the screen surprised me, Ryan. For a moment, I considered letting the call go to voicemail. Our relationship had always been distant, not hostile, just uneven. But curiosity got the better of me, so I answered. Hello. Ryan's voice sounded different than usual, less confident, less rushed. Hey, he said. Hey. There was an awkward pause. Then he cleared his throat. I wanted to talk about something. I waited. Finally, he said the words I never expected to hear. I messed up. For a second, I wasn't sure how to respond. Ryan had never been someone who admitted mistakes easily. What happened? I asked. He sighed. The business thing, it collapsed. I had suspected something like that, but hearing him say it directly still felt strange. I'm sorry about that, I said. Another pause followed. Then he added quietly, and I'm sorry about the wedding. This time, his voice carried something real, not casual, not dismissive, just honest. I didn't realize how much it would affect you. I leaned against the kitchen counter, thinking about everything that had happened that day. For years, Ryan had lived inside the same pattern as the rest of us, a pattern where his needs always seemed to rise to the top. Maybe he had never fully noticed it either. Thank you for saying that, I replied. He exhaled slowly. I mean it. Then he added something else. I saw the photos. Which ones? The wedding pictures Dad showed me. I smiled faintly. They turned out pretty nice. Yeah, he said. But one of them stood out. I already knew which photo he meant. The one with Grandpa Whitman walking you down the aisle. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That was a good moment. Ryan was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said something I had never heard from him before. You deserved better that day. Those words surprised me more than anything else. But surprisingly, they didn't reopen old wounds. Instead, they simply confirmed what I had already learned. Sometimes closure doesn't come from dramatic apologies. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through small moments of honesty. After we hung up, I walked into the living room where Daniel was reading on the couch. Ryan called, I said. Daniel looked up. How did it go? Better than I expected. He smiled slightly. That's good. I sat beside him and leaned against his shoulder. Outside the window, light snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting through the streetlights. For a while, we sat quietly, watching the snow, and as I did, I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The childhood disappointments, the wedding day shock, the unexpected kindness, the quiet healing afterward. If someone had asked me years earlier what family meant, I probably would have answered differently. Back then, I believed family was simply the people you were born into, the people who shared your last name, the people who were supposed to show up automatically. But life had taught me something more complicated. Family isn't defined by expectation. Family is defined by choice. It's the people who show up when the moment matters. The people who stand beside you even when they have no obligation to do so. Sometimes those people are your parents. Sometimes they're friends. And sometimes they're a quiet grandfather who simply offers his arm and says, you don't have to walk alone. Looking back now, I realized something beautiful. My wedding day had not been ruined. It had simply revealed the truth about who my family was, and the truth about the life Daniel and I were beginning together, a life built not on obligation, but on presence, on choice, on love that shows up. Because in the end, the most important people in your life will always be the ones who step forward, when everyone else steps away. Nearly a year passed after the wedding, and by that time, the story that once felt so painful had slowly transformed into something else. Perspective. Life with Daniel continued to grow in small, beautiful ways. Our apartment became filled with quiet routines that made every day feel steady and warm. Weekend breakfasts, evening walks, late-night conversations about the future. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. But somehow, those ordinary moments felt like the most valuable things in the world. And occasionally, when friends visited our home, they would notice the framed photographs from the wedding. Some of them would pause at the same picture every time. The one where Mr. Whitman was walking me down the aisle. What's the story behind this one? They would ask. At first, I used to hesitate before answering. Not because the memories still hurt, but because the story had once been complicated. However, over time, I realized something important. It didn't have to be complicated anymore. So I would tell them the truth. I would explain how my parents had left that morning to help my brother, how the moment I had imagined my whole life suddenly disappeared, and how, just minutes before the ceremony began, someone unexpected stepped forward. Someone who didn't have to. Someone who simply chose to. Whenever people heard that part, they usually reacted the same way. That must have been incredibly hard. And they were right. It had been. But then I would add something else, something I didn't understand until much later. That day also gave me one of the most important lessons of my life. Because sometimes life doesn't give you the moment you expected. Instead, it gives you a clearer view of reality. And reality, as uncomfortable as it can be, often brings clarity that expectations never could. For years, I had waited for my parents to prove something to me, to prove that I mattered the same way Ryan did, to prove that when the moment came, they would choose me. But the wedding day showed me something else. People don't reveal who they are through promises. They reveal it through choices. And once you see those choices clearly, something inside you changes. You stop begging for attention. You stop hoping people will become someone they've never been. Instead, you begin focusing on the people who are already standing beside you, the ones who show up without being asked, the ones who quietly step forward when it matters most. Daniel was one of those people. Sophie was another. And of course, Mr. Whitman, a man who had known me for less than 2 years, yet somehow understood exactly what I needed in the most important moment of my life. Looking back now, I realized something that once seemed impossible. If my parents had shown up that day, I might never have understood how powerful that moment truly was, because sometimes the absence of certain people doesn't ruin your story. Sometimes it reveals the people who actually belong in it. And in my case, that realization turned what could have been the worst day of my life into something entirely different. A beginning. Not the beginning I had imagined as a child, but the one that mattered. A life built with someone who chooses me every single day. And a family that isn't defined by obligation, but by presence. So if you're listening to this story and you've ever felt like someone important didn't show up for you, remember this. The people who truly belong in your life will never force you to beg for their presence. They will simply walk beside you. And when they do, you'll realize you were never meant to walk alone. Elena's story isn't just about a wedding. It's a story about choice, self-worth, and realizing who truly belongs in your life. For years, Elena tried to be understanding. She patiently waited, hoping that one day her family would see her worth. But her wedding day revealed a truth that was sometimes hard to accept. Not everyone in life will choose you, and that doesn't mean you're not good enough. Sometimes, it's simply because they weren't meant to be with you on that journey. That day, Elena's parents didn't come, but someone else stepped up and said, "You don't have to go alone." That moment changed the entire meaning of the story. Because ultimately, true family isn't always about blood ties. True family is the people who are there when you need them most. They choose to stand by you, even when they're not obligated to. So the biggest lesson from this story is, don't spend your life waiting for validation from people who are never ready to give you it. Instead, cherish those who are always there when you need them. support you in important moments, and never leave you to walk alone. Because sometimes, the people who enter your life most unexpectedly become your true family. If you were in Elena's situation, what would you do if your family didn't show up on your most important day? Would you forgive? Or would you choose to move on and build your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think or touched your emotions, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so we can explore more meaningful stories together.